So I didn't realize until I Googled it this past week that this past Thursday was exactly 40 days after Easter. And this is also known as Ascension Day. This is the day we remember Jesus being lifted up into the clouds and returning to heaven. This is also the day that we close the chapter on Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection that we find in the Gospels. And then next week, some of you may know, we will be celebrating Pentecost, which is when we celebrate the fact that the Holy Spirit came down to earth like tongues of fire. This is where we open the chapter on the beginnings of the early church, and we see that the gospel was meant to be preached to everyone, no matter where they're from or what language they speak. But today, we find ourselves right in the middle of these two chapters, waiting. It's part of the story of the church that we don't often really think about, this time in between Jesus' ascension and Pentecost. Here and now in our time and day in the future, we know what comes next after Jesus' ascension, but what about the disciples in their time? All they have are promises that Jesus is returning, and soon. So the disciples stand and look towards heaven and wait for Jesus to come back, until an angel comes down and reassures them that he will return, just not right now. Apparently, returning soon didn't mean within the next few hours. So they come down from the mountaintop, they meet back up with the 120 other followers of Jesus that had been, and as they gathered in the upper room where they had had the Last Supper, I think we can imagine that they're starting to feel the loss of their leader. He was their teacher, their rabbi, and even their friend. And now they must figure out how to move on without him. But Jesus isn't the only one who's missing here. The apostles are also down one man, and the horror of why may just be starting to set in. What is the aftermath of Judas's betrayal? This is another part of the story of the early church we often don't dwell on. What was it like after Jesus ascended and the dust and the chaos began to settle down? What happened when the disciples could finally start to process exactly what Judas had done? Were there outbursts of anger over dinner, wondering how they could not have known that Judas would betray them? Or were there quiet sobs even at bedtime, trying as they tried not to wake the others? Or were there nights where none of them could sleep, so they sat up together in silence, grieving until the sun rose? But they couldn't grieve forever. There were almost 100 other people, other disciples of Jesus, who were looking to the apostles for leadership and how to move forward. So they had to figure out something of a plan. Now, the apostles probably could have just continued on in ministry with just the 11 of them. But one day after Jesus' ascension, Peter got up in front of the group of 120 as they prayed and they fellowshiped together. Then he proceeded to make his argument for calling an apostle to replace Judas, and the verses he uses to back himself up are from Isaiah and the Psalms. And he was convincing, because in the end, calling another apostle became one of the first big decisions of the group that would become the early church. And then, as our scripture said, the group of disciples decided that this person needed to have also witnessed the entirety of Jesus' ministry, from his baptism to his resurrection, just like the rest of the apostles. This criteria whittled down the candidates to 2 men, and ultimately the lots fell on Matthias. Serious question here. Have you ever had a potential boss roll dice to decide whether or not you were going to get a job? For me personally, I've never had that happen, and quite honestly, if Jason or Connie had pulled out a pair of dice and asked me to call odds or evens when I was interviewing for this position here, I probably would not be standing here today, no matter how those dice fell. But in all honesty, there's really no precedence for picking a new apostle here. The disciples are just doing their best. All 11 of the living apostles were called by Jesus himself. Matthias now becomes the only one who wasn't. I think here what they're trying to do is they are trying to find a way to have God directly call the next apostle, just as Jesus called the rest of them. But it's just not the same. It really can't be. The clatter of dice on a clay floor just doesn't have the same ring as the sound of Jesus calling your name. So how must have that felt to Matthias? Keep in mind, Matthias has been with this group since the very beginning. He knew Jesus, chose to follow him even though Jesus didn't call him personally, as far as we know. He stuck around through a couple of rounds of disciples deserting Jesus due to some tough teachings, and then stayed all the way to the cross. He apparently was also in one of the groups who saw Jesus resurrected. And in all of that time, Jesus never called him as an apostle. Instead, Jesus called Judas, and well, we all know how that went. So now that Jesus and Judas are both gone, suddenly Matthias is being called on to be an apostle? What is he, the second string running back for the apostles team or something? Jesus' first string pick ended up getting injured in a critical play, and now they're calling Matthias onto the field for the postseason? How uncomfortable must that have been? But Matthias can't say no to this, right? The dice say that God has called him to take Judas's place. But what if that didn't feel good enough for Matthias? Or more to the point, what if Matthias didn't feel good enough to be an apostle? Because of how he was called, what if he compared himself to the other 11 apostles who were directly called by Jesus? Did he feel less than them because he hadn't been? Did he feel like he needed to be so much more, so much better than the others to catch up to where they were? I mean, after Peter's little speech, it seems like at least Peter's got it all together, right? It really does seem like everyone else has it together sometimes, doesn't it? Does it ever feel like everybody else is just a step or two ahead of you and you are scrambling to catch up? You scroll social media and you see these photos of smiling families and pretty gardens, new cars, or new houses. You attend community groups or Bible studies, and everyone else is just answering these questions so easily, and your brain just can't even process them right now. And when you're at work, it seems like everyone else is getting things done, they're getting the promotions, while you're scrambling to try and stay on top of mounting deadlines and wondering if you should even be there in the first place. I've been there a few times during my life, but I think one of the times it was the worst for me was during my final year of college. I got accepted into one of the top fellowships in my university for research, and while I was very proud of it, I often found myself comparing my accomplishments and my future plans to other people in my cohort. To give you an idea of who I was working with, I was working with people, one person who would, sorry, this one's out of order. Give you an idea of who I was working with. One student went on to work for the American Political Science Association. Another now puts on events that thousands of people attend multiple times per year. And another went on to become Miss Texas. She was the runner-up for Miss America and is now running for political office. So when working with so many incredibly accomplished people, I would often question why I had been accepted into the exact same fellowship. What made it worse is that, like Matthias, I actually wasn't picked as a fellow initially. It was only when one of the other fellows had to drop out that I was asked to fill that final spot. That definitely contributed to my anxiety and the stress about not being good enough to be in the cohort. But the truth was, I did belong just as much as anybody else. When the director of the fellowship called me in and asked if I wanted the spot a few months after the fellowship started, he explained that the reason I hadn't even been offered it in the first place was due to cohort makeup. My skills as a researcher weren't in question, it was just that the other student's background was in engineering and mine was in the social sciences, and the fellowship wanted to expand into engineering. But when that didn't work out, there was apparently no hesitation from the board in asking me to take on that final position. I was good enough to be a fellow. I just hadn't been the right fit for the position at that time. And maybe that's what happened to Matthias. He was good enough all along to be an apostle, but he just wasn't the right fit at the right time yet. Since he witnessed Jesus' baptism, it's possible he was a disciple of John the Baptist first, and then started following Jesus because of John's teachings. So maybe Jesus knew he didn't have to call him by name at that point, because he knew Matthias would already be there. What if Jesus was already preparing Matthias for his future ministry, and Matthias didn't even know it? What if in the days after he became an apostle, when he's learning those ropes and figuring out what his ministry looks like, he starts remembering those lessons that Jesus taught? Maybe there's a comment or two that Jesus made to him that comes up in his mind, but now has a whole new meaning that he's an apostle. Maybe he's answering a question from another follower of Jesus, and he realizes he's saying the exact same words that he remembers Jesus teaching him. There's this quote that gets thrown around a lot. God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. I really don't like that quote for a lot of reasons, mainly because I genuinely don't think God calls unqualified people. What I think happens sometimes is that God calls people who don't realize they're qualified until they're in the middle of it. Have you ever experienced that? Realizing you were capable of so much more when you were on the other side of a difficult time, or even in the middle of it? What carried you through that time? For me, I started believing that I belonged in my fellowship when I stopped comparing my work to the others in the group and just focused on what I was supposed to be doing. I started believing that I was good enough when I stopped comparing myself to others in my cohort and instead focused in on who God was calling me to be. And actually, my call to ministry ended up being a big part of that. So did I go on to become the most accomplished person in my cohort? Yeah, one of them was almost Miss America, so I'm going to say probably not by any objective standards, but honestly, I think I am exactly where I need to be right now, and I wouldn't trade that for the world. So wherever we are in our lives, our careers, our marriages, our families, we can't compare ourselves to other people on Facebook or Instagram, or even anyone else we interact with. Even if we're in the same job or life stage as someone else, our lives are so completely different. We are not called to be exactly like our neighbor, to have the exact same life as them. We are called to love our neighbors and to love God. And that sometimes includes following God into places we're not so sure we belong or we're good enough to be in. But maybe in those spaces is where we start hearing God's voice, letting us know that we're exactly where we need to be. Matthias was always going to be an apostle. And maybe he starts to realize that as Jesus' teachings wind through his mind, and as he stops comparing himself to the other apostles, and instead focuses in on who God has called him to be. And maybe we start to realize that when we stop comparing ourselves to others and to who we think we should be, and instead focus in on who God has called us to be.